Jesse Owens, Young Record Breaker by M. Eboch, Chapters 1 and 2. For anyone who refuses to give up. Chapter 1, Saving J.C. James Cleveland Owens woke up in the dark. He could hear his family stirring. Soon Mama would make breakfast. He lay in the dark and rubbed his chest. He felt a bump, and it was sore. J.C. sighed, remembering the day before September 12, 1918, his 5th birthday. They didn't have money for presents in the Owens household, but a birthday was still special. It was one of the few days they got to eat meat during the week. Yesterday, it was ham. Everyone made a fuss about J.C. since he was the baby of the family. It was fun. J.C. jumped out of bed and pulled on his pants. By the time Mama put cornbread in front of him, he'd forgotten about the bump. He couldn't forget for long, though. The bump kept growing and hurting. As it grew out, it also seemed to press in on his chest. Jessie told Mama, but there wasn't much she could do. The nearest doctor to Oakville, Alabama, was 75 miles away, in Birmingham. But it hardly mattered. The family didn't have any money for a doctor. A month later, J.C. could barely breathe with the pressure on his chest. He wondered if he would die. He lay down, gasping, unable to sleep. He heard his parents whispering. "We've got to do something, Henry," his mother said. "You took one of those bumps off his leg once." "But this one's so big," Mama said, "and it's near his heart." "Emma," his father started to say. "Don't say it." "I'm going to say it," his father insisted. "If the Lord wants him—" His mother interrupted again, her voice rising. "The Lord doesn't want this child." 3 of her babies had died at birth. 10 had lived, though 2 more would die young. Some would say Emma Owens was lucky that so many of her children had survived. In those days, many poor families lost more than half of their children at birth and in early childhood, and mothers often died giving birth without a doctor's care. But Emma couldn't bear the thought of losing her child. Young J.C. had a special place in her heart. She'd had him when she was in her late 30s and thought she was too old to have more children. She called James Cleveland her gift child. J.C. finally fell asleep. Sometime later, his mother shook him awake. It was still dark out. J.C. looked around to see all his brothers and sisters awake and watching. A few of them tried to smile at him, but he could tell by their eyes that they were worried. His mother picked up a knife and held it in the fire until the blade seemed to glow. She walked over to J.C. and looked straight into his eyes. "I'm going to take off the bump now, J.C.," she said. He felt the knife going into his skin. It went around and around as his mother tried to cut the thing loose. J.C. had felt pain before. It had hurt when his mother took the bump off his leg. Every winter, he got sick with what they called the devil's cold. The coughing and burning fever nearly killed him. And once, he got caught in an animal trap his father had set. But this was much worse. J.C. saw tears running down his father's face. He heard a voice that sounded far away. "Aw, Mama, no." He realized it was his own voice. Finally, he blacked out. When he woke up, it was still dark. J.C. didn't even know if it was the same night or the next. Everyone was still in the house. J.C. could tell from their clothes that they hadn't been to the fields. The only time no one went to work was on Christmas Day or when someone died. J.C. knew he must be dying. He tried to speak but couldn't. The family gathered around. "I got it all out," his mother said softly. "All of it." But there were tears in her eyes. She pressed a crop bag against J.C.'s chest. The blood quickly soaked through that one. She replaced it with another. J.C. kept bleeding. They couldn't wash and dry the bags quickly enough. When they ran out of crop bags, they used rags. Then they used pieces of their clothing. The bleeding went on all night. In the morning, J.C.'s father and brothers had to go work in the fields. His mother stayed by him, mopping up blood and praying. Finally, she fell into an exhausted sleep beside him. J.C. watched in horror as his blood soaked into her shirt. J.C. tried to stay awake, but he kept passing out. Every time he woke up, his first thought was, "Am I still bleeding?" He always was. How much blood could he have left? J.C. woke to find the house dark and his mother asleep again at his side. J.C. heard a faint voice that sounded miles away. He tried to lift himself up and got up on one elbow. It was a dark, moonless night, and he couldn't see anything. He sat up, trembling with weakness. He could still feel the blood trickling down his chest, but now he could hear his father's words. "She'll die." What could that mean? J.C. stumbled toward the voice. It was coming from just outside the front door. "Oh, Lord Jesus," his father went on, "please hear me. This saving means everything. She'll die if he dies, and if she dies, Lord, we'll all die, all of us." J.C. crawled to the doorway. He could feel his blood coming in spurts, and knew that he hardly had any left. He felt a glowing kind of haziness. It scared him more than he'd ever been scared before. His head spun, but he dug his fingernails into the wood floor. He pulled himself toward the open doorway. Outside, his father was on his knees praying. "She'll die if you take him from me. She always said he was born special. Please don't take him from me, Lord. I'll do anything, the hardest thing, to pay you back." J.C. must have made a noise. His father turned to him, still kneeling, and reached out. "J.C.!" Even in the black night, J.C. somehow felt his father's eyes looking into his own. "Pray, J.C.," his father said. "Pray, James Cleveland." J.C. cleared his throat. "What should I say, Daddy?" "I don't know, J.C. Just pray." They knelt together side by side and prayed. Finally, J.C.'s father lifted him in his arms and carried him back into the house. The bleeding had stopped. In the morning, J.C. could sit up easily. By dinner time, he was eating like a mule. The following day, he could walk around. By the weekend, he was helping in the fields. "He may be sickly in body," J.C.'s father said, "but our boy has a strong spirit. If he survived that pain, he'll survive anything life has to offer. Pain won't mean nothing to him now." Chapter 2. A Fight. J.C.'s father, Henry Owens, was the son of former slaves. He had nothing but his shack, a mule, and his work as a sharecropper. He worked for the white man who owned the land. Henry plowed, planted, and harvested the crops. Then he kept half and gave the other half to his landlord. That was the way people lived all through the South. Growing food meant hard work. Even the children helped in the field. In the spring, they ran a plow behind the mule and planted cotton and corn in the fields. Beans, onions, tomatoes, and squash grew in the family garden. They had to be planted and picked as well. Once the crops were in the ground, the boys could sometimes steal a few hours for fun. One hot morning, they headed off to the local swimming hole. J.C. ran ahead, his thin legs pumping. His tough bare feet slapped the ground. He sucked in the hot, humid air, feeling his lungs strain. He felt like he could run anywhere. Running made him feel free. J.C. saw the sparkle of water ahead. He let out a whoop and ran faster. He leapt from the bank and flew out over the water. His splash sent the water spraying. Neighbor boys, both black and white, laughed and shouted. One of them swam to J.C. and dunked him playfully. J.C.'s brothers tumbled in after him. They splashed and swam and wrestled in the mud. The cool water felt wonderful. Maybe later they would go possum hunting. Maybe they would camp around a fire that night, the boys and their dogs. On a day like that, they could forget the cold winds of winter. They could forget the hard work of planting. They could forget the cotton harvest that was coming. Life was simple and good. Finally, the boys crawled to the bank and settled under the oak trees. J.C.'s brothers and some of the other boys started fishing. They used string with hooks made from bits of scrap metal. If they were lucky, they might bring a fish or two home for dinner. If not, they would enjoy the lazy afternoon anyway. They sprawled along the edge of the pond, boasting and teasing one another. But J.C. didn't feel like fishing. He prowled about, picking up stones and tossing them into the water. "You'll scare the fish," a boy grumbled, just as if they hadn't all been splashing around a few minutes before. "What's up, J.C.?" his brother Prentice asked. "Can't you sit still for a minute?" J.C. grinned and shook his head. How could he sit still when it felt so good to move? He trotted away from the lake, not caring where he was going. He knew this part of Alabama too well to get lost. He knew the farms and the woods. He knew his neighbors. He knew the little town where he went to school when he didn't have to work in the fields. J.C.'s feet took him across a little bridge. He stopped and gazed up at a large white house. This was where his daddy's boss lived. It was hard to imagine people needing so much room. J.C. had only seen a few houses like that. All of them belonged to rich white people. Many of his neighbors were white, but white or black, they were mostly poor. Only a few white people owned the land and had money. Everyone else worked for those landowners. J.C. didn't really care. He had his family, and they had enough to eat. He didn't miss what he had never had, and he remembered his daddy's advice. No matter how hungry you ever get, JC, and no matter how much the man next door has in his cupboard, don't let yourself envy him, and don't ever let yourself hate him either. JC heard a shout. He turned to see one of the landowner's sons, Lawrence Cannon. "What are you looking at?" Lawrence said. "Nothing," JC said. "I was just looking." He smiled. His father had told him, "Always smile when you talk to white people. Be careful what you say. If they take offense, you could be in real trouble. Be polite and be careful." This boy was JC's age, but JC didn't know him well. Rich white people didn't play with poor black children. They didn't go to the same school either. JC's school was only for black children. Still, JC thought he could be friends with anyone. Why not? Lawrence stepped closer and laughed. "Look at you, in those rags. You don't even have enough clothes to cover your dirty body." JC looked down at himself. It was true. His clothes were ragged. His shirt had been handed down from brother to brother, all the way down to JC. It had been torn and mended 100 times. The wet shirt stuck to JC's skin as it dried. The cloth was so thin, you could practically see through it. JC's smile wavered as he looked at Lawrence's clothes. He had a shirt with buttons up the front. The buttons were all the same. The shirt didn't look like it had ever been mended. It was too new. The boy had pants that reached all the way down to his ankles and didn't have holes in the knees. He even had shiny dark shoes. Still, JC tried to do what his father always told him. "You sure do have nice clothes," he said. "I wish I had clothes like that." Lawrence laughed long and loud. He turned away and said, "Did you hear that? This dirty little cotton picker wants clothes like mine." JC hadn't seen the girls sitting under a tree. One was Lawrence's sister, and the other was a neighborhood girl. They were dressed in long, pretty dresses and had ribbons in their hair. JC burned with shame as they glanced at him and giggled. "I'll have nice clothes someday," JC insisted. "You'll see." Lawrence turned back to him with a sneer. "You'll never have anything. You will always be a poor piece of dirt, just like your daddy and your mama." JC's smile was gone now. "Don't you say bad things about my mama." The boy took a step closer. He was a little taller than JC and a lot heavier. "And what are you going to do about it? Your mama ain't nothing but a—" JC didn't wait for Lawrence to finish. He threw himself at the boy. "You keep your mouth shut." Lawrence fell backward, with JC on top of him. Lawrence yelled, but JC didn't hear what he said. He was too mad. Hands grabbed JC's arms and pulled him up. They held him off the ground so his feet kicked the air. JC looked right and left and saw Lawrence's older brothers. He twisted and kicked, but he couldn't get free. Lawrence stood up and brushed off his clothes. "Now you'll pay," he said. "I'll cut my initials in your face." JC blinked, trying not to cry. He couldn't think what to do. His father's advice came back to him, but it was too late. He couldn't think of any words to make these mean boys let him go. He couldn't even make himself say he was sorry. "Hold him," Lawrence said, "while I get a knife." JC squirmed. The hands dug into his arms. JC took a deep breath and suddenly felt calm. He remembered something else his daddy had said. Pain wouldn't bother JC, not since the time Mama cut off the bump. No matter what they did to him, he wouldn't cry or scream. He would keep smiling, even if they hurt him. They might bruise his body or cut his face, but they couldn't kill his spirit. JC heard a shout and the pounding of running feet. He craned his head to look back over his shoulder. His brothers were running towards him. The hands let go and JC dropped to the ground. He landed on his knees in the dirt. He scrambled to his feet as his brothers thundered up to him. They stopped, gasping for breath. "You okay?" Prentice asked. JC nodded. He turned to see the white boys running up to their house. Quincy said, "Let's get out of here." They ran back across the bridge and didn't stop until they were outside their house. "How did it happen?" Prentice asked. JC looked down at his feet. "Lawrence laughed at my clothes. 2 girls were watching." Prentice patted JC's shoulder. "He was just showing off, I bet, but we showed them." JC glanced back towards the big house. "What will they do?" His brothers looked at each other. Prentice said, "Probably nothing. They won't tell if they could get in trouble too, and Mr. Cannon is fair enough, but you keep your distance for a while." Quincy said, "It never does any good to fight with white people. They always win." Prentice scowled. "You sound like Pop. Sometimes you have to fight." "Didn't you hear?" Quincy said. "Just last week, a man was arrested in Decatur. They said he insulted a white woman. He didn't do nothing but try to sell her some vegetables. But who will believe him?" Prentice's shoulders slumped. "I know. Sometimes it seems like we can never get ahead, but there's got to be more to life than this." He straightened. "Someday I'd like to own my own land. My own, so no one can tell me what to do with it." "They say it's better in the North," Sylvester said. "A man can get a job in a factory. He can make real money, wear a suit and shiny shoes and a hat, maybe even buy an automobile." The boys fell silent as they thought of that. Only a few rich people owned cars. It was hard to imagine having that much money. Finally, Prentice said, "Maybe someday we'll find out." He slapped JC on the back. "Don't tell Mama what happened. She'd just worry." JC nodded and went inside. His mother stood by the stove, running an iron over a pair of pants. A basket of clean laundry sat at her feet. These clothes didn't belong to the Owens family. JC's mother washed and ironed other people's clothes for money. JC watched his mother as sweat ran down her face and darkened the back of her old dress. It was hot in the shack, but she had to stand by the stove while she worked. She put the iron back on the stove to stay hot and neatly folded the pants. She glanced at JC and smiled. "What kind of trouble have you been getting into?" JC looked down and rubbed a bare toe across the floor. "Nothing. I just been looking around." "Well, you be careful now. You look hard enough for the devil, and the devil will find you." Mama picked up a dress from the basket. JC stared at the frilly dress. He remembered the way the girls had giggled. His face burned with the memory. He walked over to his mother. "Mama, someday I'm going to have a nice suit of clothes." She smiled down at him. "I bet you will, baby." "I'll buy you a nice dress, too," JC went on. "We'll all have nice clothes, and maybe even an automobile." He squared his shoulders. "Someday I'm going to be somebody." His mother put down the iron. She gathered him in her arms and hugged him tight. "I know you will, baby. You already are."